All right, Sarah's gonna be joining me for the review class today. She has a couple things, she wants to bring up. I have a couple things I wanna bring up, hopefully that you guys have things y'all wanna bring up, okay? So I don't traditionally guide a review day because I don't know where we need to fine tune things. I do know this, we've spent weeks putting the game plan in place. So today isn't a day to go over everything. It's to fine tune things. Like if you have a question or a clarification about planes and axes, not, can you explain planes and axes? I'm just going to say, go rewatch the lectures that we've done them. But if it's to fine tune, like this is kind of confusing me, or I'm not quite sure about this compared to that, or I understand this, but how would that apply to that? That's why we're here, okay? So the first thing I'm going to mention before I toss it over to Sarah for her to say her things is the kind of questions. On your syllabus, it says, guys, the questions are going to be, it's via Moodle, so you got to have your laptop or no cell phones. All right, that's the one rule that's on there. So your laptop or your iPad, I'm okay with that. Just remember, perspective, like if you have a laptop, you're seeing what I'm seeing. But if you have an iPad and it's laying on the ground, then that dude is on his back. So I'm only bringing that up because if you're kind of not sure about planes and axes, feel free to take your iPad and just put it like you're used to seeing it on the screen. Does that make sense? I mean, I know that kind of sounds simple, but just sometimes that messes with people. And what I'll try to do, like if I'm talking about planes and axes, I might say like in your source materials, like the pin is facing the back of the class. Like I'll say that on the test. So if you have your iPad laying down and you'd be like, but the pin is facing the ceiling. Well, yeah, on your iPad, but I'm telling you the pin is facing the back of the class just to try to make sure we're all on the same page about the visual. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? Most of your questions in terms of application is going to come from a before or after where we have context. Where did you start? Where did you finish? How did you have to move to get there? Or it's going to come from a starting position. And I think in class I use terms like imagine that this is a video and we have it on pause. And I say, okay, from this starting position, the dumbbell goes up or the dumbbell goes down. Now, I can't tell you the elbow flexes or the elbow extends because I'm trying to assess whether you know the difference between flexion and extension. So I have to use terms like from here, dumbbell goes up, from here, dumbbells goes down, or from here, elbow starts moving towards anatomical. It's anatomical. If the elbow starts moving from here to anatomical, we have to have extension to go home. If the elbow starts going away from anatomical, even though it is away from anatomical, it's like 90 degrees from anatomical or 90 miles from anatomical, it can still go further. Does that make sense? Like I can, even though I'm 90 degrees east, I can still go 100. So that's the kind of verbiage that we're going to use on the test, before and afters, or fixed photos, which is a reference of a start. And then I give you the rest so that you know how I had to move, whether to go to anatomical, away from anatomical, up, down, that kind of stuff. Make sense? Position. Do not confuse position for motion. If all I did was give you this picture and I said, what's the position of the elbow? And your answer choices were flexed, anatomical, flexion, extension. If I asked you for the position, it's incorrect to say flexion. Flexion is a motion. If he's not moving at all, how in the world can you justify that that's the action of getting into fetal? Does that make sense? And it just, we see it just so many times where I think it's our Pavlovian brain that just wants to say flexion just by seeing a flexed position. Make sense? Sarah, I'll let you, and it could be groupie stuff, it could be study stuff, it could be tips, it could be whatever you want, and then we'll open it up to them. Just do me a favor no, you can stay there. I'll rotate the.
Well, I do have a grouping going, and I'll have whatever I can into the class, so maybe we could send a link on the Outlook or whatever for people that aren't here, but actually it's gonna pull this over. And if you came to those full study hours last week, I might have taught you this A, B, C thing, and I think it was really helpful, so I kind of wanted to show the rest of the class. We'll take this scenario on the left with this A and B motion. So I like to think of position and motion and ED and ION kind of as a check on the test. Like I would like to have something I can write next to, and I know that it makes sense. Like it'll check out. So I would do A, B, C.
You will get scratch paper.
Right. So this is like number one. That's how I would have it on my test. And whenever Dr. Campbell says the analogy with where did you start? Where did you end? That's with the, I-10 going somewhere. This is where did you start is A. And where you finished is C. And how you got there is B. So this is a position. This is a position. And this is how you got there. So that would be your motion.
So if we were gonna dust a little physics on it, your A would be your position initial, PI, C would be your position final, and then the B would be how did you move from your start positions you need.
So like that being said, this will have to be an ED ending, ED ending, ION ending, right? This would be the check on the test kind of thing. So with this, let's do an elbow question. Let's say Dr. Campbell gives you that first picture and he just says elbow question mark. So you know that you're analyzing the elbows. What would be our starting position from the left? Let's. And we know that we have that right because it's ED. And then let's go to the ending position. Him on the right. What's the position? So then, without even looking at that picture, if I start flexed and then I ended extended, what motion had to get me to an extended position from a flex position? Extension.
And on holidays and weekends. Yes, it is.
Right.
Gotta be.
So this and this will give me this, and if you had just these two twos, you could figure out this one. Does that make sense? So on the test, if you're ever confused, you can just do your, okay, can't think of the motion maybe, even though there's only so many answer choices for the test, you can do this and figure it out.
Sarah, I want to add on to that. First of all, this was Sarah's idea, and I love it. Like, she told me she did this, I was like, that's a great teaching tool. I want to emphasize though, when you're doing it on the paper, you should. It'll help to check your work. We analyze motion joint by joint. So like even before you do the position stuff, hey, I'm analyzing elbow. I'm analyzing shoulder. Because guys, there may be questions where the motion is shoulder, but I might ask you what's happening at the elbow. The intent isn't to be tricky. The intent is to see if you remember that elbow motion isn't just form default. So students, when we're going over the test, is like, well, I saw shoulder. I just assumed you were asking about shoulder. And then I'll politely point to where I say, what does this word say? And they're like, oh, it says elbow. So we're trying to help you help yourself. You know, I'm not asking those kind of questions to try to get you. I'm trying to see if you remember that we analyze motion joint by joint. And we do not assume. If I ask you about elbow, tell me about elbow. But that's why I would ask you a question where I'm asking about something that didn't move, even though something else moved. It's to knew that, whoa, that elbow stayed in the same position. So it works with Sarah's teaching tool here, is that if my elbow started in an extended anatomical position and it finished in anatomical position, it's impossible for it to go anywhere. Because my elbow doesn't care about what my shoulder is. They're two separate joints.
So on the test, he might ask that, like, what motion occurred at the elbow? Because you're seeing this.
Yeah.
And what motion did occur at the elbow? None. That would be literally the answer.
And most students would miss it because one, they learn, well, arm goes forward must be, or two, you just assumed I was asking about the shoulder and you didn't read the question where I asked you about the elbow. And again, I know sometimes that can be frustrating, but I'm telling you why I would ask that question. Is to see if you, oh, I don't want to be distracted by the shoulder. He's asking me about the elbow, let me zoom in and see how the elbow changed position, if it.
My number is right here, just in case anybody doesn't have any questions. You want to ask out loud. I understand in a big classroom, you might not feel comfortable asking everyone a question. So either you can text me, Dr. Campbell's numbers on his syllabus. He answers pretty quickly.
Unless it's Tuesday evening. Right. I'm old, that we're a bit early. So if you text me the night before the test, questions, you may not hear back from me at all. All right, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna leave Sarah up there and I'm gonna let you guys, I'm gonna open it up for general questions. Clarifications.
And I'll grab my phone if you want to text it.
What do y'all want to, what do we know about the test? It's going to be 35 questions. It's going to be a variety of, you know, I genuinely try to not give you anything that's not useful. So when students say, when you ask about this, when you ask about that, I'm like, is it in your materials? Did I talk about it in class? Then I can ask about it. But if you think about it, everything we've done has walked us through of these concepts. There's really no wasted information. But I don't know what I'm going to ask. I just know it's going to be about this kind of stuff. I haven't read the test yet. Make sure you have, like I said, don't come to class and not have your laptops or your iPads. Make sure it's charged. Come prepared. Okay, come prepared.
Sarah,
All right, we'll be all right. Well, go ahead. No, it's all going to be multiple choice. And I do that because I myself am dyslexic. And so if sagittal plane might turn into Sagittarius plane if I don't have the right. Okay? So that's what takes me the longest to write because I have to spell check every word. But no, you don't have to fill in the blank. It's going to be multiple choice. That being said, though, I will, and I love Sarah's feedback because when I took this class as an undergraduate, it was in the 1900s. Sometimes the answer choices can mess with you. Every question can technically be answered fill in the blank. Like, you know, in other words, if we ask that question in class, you can, and we said, there's your start, there's your finish. You don't have to have answer choices to know that was a bilateral elbow extension. So what I try to encourage students is just answer it on your paper and then see which choice matches your answer. Because I could see how if you jump to the different answers, you know, flex, extended, flexion, sometimes that can kind of mess with it. But the only definitions would be like I might say which of the following, but it's not even a definition, it's an understanding of which of the following axis is always associated with the sagittal plane. Or, you know, indirectly, like indirectly understanding that my change in position is joint motion, but I would never be like, yeah, yeah. You have, because you have classes for that, you know, you have physics classes for that. So yeah, I'm not gonna, all of those kind of questions are embedded in understanding joint position and joint motion. Good question.
So the classification of joints, I'm still a little shaky on what to expect between structural and functional, so inner or
Very fair. Very fair. Let me, I'll tell you what, is there any, I'm gonna pull that up to go over it. Does anybody have a study question or prep question that Sarah might be able to kind of give some advice to while I pull up the Google materials?
For studying, would you just like look up pictures and then just like track those out on the lines and? Yeah, I would kind of do like how we just had there where it was like elbow question mark where you joint by joint, and I would try to analyze as many joints I could based off that picture. Like somebody texted me the other day and asked me for some examples, and I was like, well, if you know you're being tested on the sagittal plane right now, you can look up sagittal plane exercises. Now their answer might give you a motion, even though it's just one picture, so I wouldn't really look at what they're saying. I would like test your knowledge and then send it to Dr. Campbell and be like, hey, is the elbows this? Yeah. And he would, and then he might even give you another example of that. Like, what if I do this now? You know, and that's something that I thought was very helpful study wise.
Obviously you do you, but studying in groups, even if it's a group of two, is helpful, because how can you check your knowledge if you don't have someone there to kind of, well, I'm not quite sure about that, or like it really does, because if you're studying by yourself and you don't have anyone to kind of check you, then maybe you're not learning the right thing, or does that kind of make sense? Okay, so the classifications of joints. So we're emphasizing that our body's made up of joints. And what I'm trying to do with this slide is show you that they're categorized based off of bone articulates with bone. But what is the movement possibilities? And you have our first category, function, structural. Structural is obviously kind of how it's put together. Function is what does it do? It's two different forms of saying a similar thing. These first ones are the least movable. Structural, I gave some examples, you know, this is like fused. Desmotic is like there's ligaments that hold like the tibia and the fibula together. Those things don't move about. But technically it's two different bones that are kind of connected together, but they're not allowed for motion. And comphosis, I gave an example like that's your tooth. This isn't a dentist class, so probably not going to ask a lot about that. Specific examples. What I would ask is, hey, is this the most or the least movable? Does that make sense? Synarthrotic, is that the least or the most movable? Amphiarthrotic, is that the least, the most, or the one that's kind of in the middle? Moves more than none, but it moves less than most. That version, the cartilaginous, chondrotic is cartilage, and symphysis, like you have a little bit of play in your pubic symphysis. We don't really use this a lot for our classes because we're about motion, right? We're about significant motion. However, I still want you to at least understand this was the least, this was something in the middle. Give them all. This category is where I want you to know more, because that's what we're playing with. And functionally, we separate joints, we separate the most movable based off of axial potential, like a uniaxial hinge or a biaxial wrist. Now, notice I didn't get into, and again, I'm not holding you accountable for anything I didn't explain. I didn't give you necessarily examples in this slide. So all I want you to do is know something like, what was gliding joints is a subclassification of what? Does that make sense? A pivot joint is a subclassification of which one? And I want that to, I want you to, almost kind of like maybe a definition thing. So that way, when we go into joints that are pivots, you would have heard that before, and you'd be like, oh, a pivot is uniaxial. That means it can move in one plane. That means it moves about one axis. That means we're going to have two motions account. But I would not ask you to tell me that the radioulnar joint is a pivot or the atlas axis is a pivot. But I do want you to know that a pivot joint is a subclassification of a synovial joint, right? Synovial fluid. Makes sense that if you're going to have all that fluid in that joint, that means you're going to have some motion, right? You're going to have some oil in your car so that the engine doesn't burn up. Great question, great clarification. And I always try to give you the whys, because eventually, we're starting off with just the sagittal stuff, but eventually, like, we're going to get into, hey, this is a biaxial hinge, this is a uniaxial pivot, this is a triaxial ball and socket, and I want those words, I want you to be at least introduced to those terms as we go on to different joints. So the kind of questions would literally just be, a gliding joint is a subclass of what? A pivot would be a subclass of what? A biaxial is a subclass of what? Which class is the least? So in other words, just note, anything I would ask would literally be this joint, but not a definition, But you still have to know least, most, in the middle, least, most. Next. I had an email from a student about the lectures for Unit 2. I don't expect you to remember, I don't even remember. I said, guys, if we're ahead of our lectures, I'm going to start lecturing on the new stuff, even though you're not going to be tested on it. So that's what that week was. It was when I was out, I put ankle, subtalar, knee. Yeah, yep. But that's listed under Unit 2. So Unit 1 is Exam 1. Unit 2 is Exam 2. No plantar or dorsi. Promise you, I'm not going to go back on that. Everything is going to be about flexions and extensions. The only exception is I would not ask you to identify. I think I mentioned this in class. Again, it's about introduction, development, and mastery. I'm just introducing you to common motions that we will see in frontal, common motions we'll see in transverse. So on the test, I might say, which of the following is a common frontal plane movement that we are going to be seeing? Like literally that, not identify it. I haven't taught you that yet. Everybody knows I love Piper.
I'm not each on them just can go with both reference and everything.
First of all, that is very common for me too. It's weird. But I always want to justify. Maybe I over-explain sometimes. It's so important for us to understand these differences so that we can understand why this is flexion and extension still and not ab and adduction. Okay? So a global reference is a fixed, non-movable reference. And for us, it's almost kind of like the stage. You think about like a football field. It's a fixed, where the north end zone is, the south end zone is, right? A player could run 50 yards, but only get 2 yards that way, right? So globally, around all over Reggie Bush back in the day. But locally, right, global planes and axes for this class is the room's perspective of sagittal, frontal, and transverse. Why? Because this is where we have class and this is where we're taking our test. So you think about the front and the back of class, anterior, posterior, right? What rotates about anterior, posterior? Frontal plane spins. The sides of class, bilateral. What rotates about that? Sagittal. The ceiling and the floor, the top and the bottom, polar. What rotates about transversal? When we are in anatomical position, we see what the room sees. So in anatomical position, my front is the room's front, my back is the room's back, my sides are the room's sides, my top is the room's top, my bottom is the room's bottom. Well, we don't have to stay there. The room can't change its front, back, side, side up, down, but we can. I can literally do this, and now my front to back is lined up with the room side to side. It's not meant to be confusing. It's meant to say all of our joints, all of our articulations are from a local perspective of those joints. It has nothing to do with the room. It has nothing to do with going up or coming down or going out or coming in. Our joints have to be referenced within our joints themselves. And so, as an example, if my right elbow has a bilateral axis, this is the outside, this is the inside, the lateral, the medial. My bilateral axis of my elbow can literally line up with the polar axis of the room, and that's okay. From a local reference, this is still my elbow's bilateral axis. This is still my elbow's sagittal plane. Yeah. And what understanding those perspectives do for us is it helps us understand why this isn't horizontal ab and adduction of my elbow, or this isn't ab or adduction of my elbow. This is still flexion and extension of my elbow. Because the planes and the axes associated with my elbow move with it because it's locally referenced.
Well, to practice, we got your local, so I lay your local, your local's side. And then whenever you move it, I just kind of follow it. So then,
Awesome.
if it's, if it's this way, I know that it's transverse if I put it on itself.
Nice.
That's how
I
I
see.
do that.
And on the test, I'm going to say, from a global reference, how are my elbows flexing and extending? Well, globally, it's frontal, but locally, it's sagittal. Globally, you just said it, globally, it's transverse, but locally, it's sagittal. And I want Sarah to interject too. Some people are planes first people. Some people see the plane of spin first, and then you can associate the axis with it. Like that's how I see it. I see spin first, and then say, well, here's the spin, so the axis must be here. Here's the spin, so the axis must be here. But some people are axis first people. Some people see the axis first, and then can associate the plane. What's great about planes and axes is they're always perpendicular, so it's both ways are going to lead you to the right answer. But maybe I'm guilty of going plane first too many times because that's how I see it. But some people will see axis first, and that's okay as well.
I think if like you can see the spin on a motion, then it's easier to put the axis, and I think that that's good. So along with the split seems this past week, because I wanted to show you that if you're doing this motion, the question is where would you put the axis? Hey, that's it. This is the bilateral axis going through this joint, so that's what the point of origin to where I'm moving about is. But if I was to go this way, and now you're seeing this type of movement, you would have to go there. saying what the movement is going about, that CD disc, the hole around like a bigger circle. And then I was to do this movement. Does that make sense? So like on the test, I would probably stand up, be the person to break the ice, and do the movement and be like, okay, not that you will have that movement necessarily. So this one,
Maybe
and then maybe, yeah.
because
In a different way.
because we may have this motion. I just would not ask you to identify what that motion is called. But I could 100% say, from a global reference, what plane is that motion happening in? What axis is that motion happening about? I'm so glad that my son's old lightsaber came like that's why I keep it around. Just never know when you need a blue lightsaber. Did that answer the global and local? So fixed, it's almost kind of like north, south, east, and west is a global reference. Like it doesn't matter what direction I'm facing, the compass will always say north is that way. I could be laying down, I could be facing, it doesn't matter, it's fixed. And then for me, I wouldn't use necessarily the word north, but forward for me depends on where I'm facing, right? Forward for me might be north, but forward for me might be east. Forward for me might be, because it's my reference. And go ahead.
Given, like he gives all the context for the question that you'll need. So if it's just a picture, for example, but it is very obviously he is standing at the back of the class doing something, or he's on the side of the class, he has the reference of the door, or well, I guess that's the same thing as both sides. There would be some type of reference though. So if he came to you and you were like, oh, well, is this the right of the room's perspective? He could be like, I don't know, is it? Like, he doesn't have to answer your question if there's no context in it. I just want you to compare for that. Or if you see clouds in the picture, if it's like a upwards view and there's clouds, well, you know there's not clouds over here to the right of you, right? Like, you could understand that maybe you're looking up at a pole, maybe for example.
Yeah. Or I might say like you're laying down, looking up,
Right?
At the clouds or something. I know this. If you call me over to look at a question, I'll 100% look at it because I'm not perfect. But I might read it and say there's enough information on there for you to answer. Because remember, I'm going to tell you something that one of my old Auburn professors told me when I asked him a question about something. He said he was from the north. He was like, "Well, Brian, you're taking the test, not me." I was like, "Meh." So it's okay to call me over because I might be able to restate it for you. I might literally,
Which helps,
guys, there's sometimes, and I get it. I will literally just read the question and all of a sudden you're like, okay, now I get it. I don't mind doing that. But what I can't do is when a student says, am I on the right track with this? Or what's sagittal? Or I mean, I can't give you, right? I'm sworn to secrecy in terms of information. I think an application of global and local would be like our kin example, where it looks like it's going out because it is globally, but locally, it's not doing anything, right? So that's why it's important for us to at least understand a room's perspective of motion isn't necessarily the same as our perspective of motion, even though we might think we see things moving. You know, arm goes up doesn't mean my shoulder moved. In class, I think I used this silly analogy, but I think it works. I don't get closer to noon if I move the whole clock like this. I'm serious, right? So this would be like a global reference, but locally it's all about what's happening here. Great questions, guys. Keep them coming. We've got 15 minutes. I want to try to take advantage of as much time as we have. what's a good place to practice is Google. Like, no lie, that's where I get most of my questions from. Like, or the weight room. Like, go into the weight room and just randomly just go into a machine. And, if you're like me, put it on like the least amount of weight and just like practice flexion, extension. I'm flexed, I'm extended. Like I say, if you're awake, you can be practicing. You're sitting in your car, you're like, my knees are flexed, my hips are flexed. I get out of the car, I had knee extension, my hips had extension. What's the position of my cervical? I'm stretching. I go from here, I look up, I have extension, look back down, I have flexion. But remember, the key thing is, even though I said up and down there, flexion and extension has nothing to do with ups and downs. Are you going in the feet or are you coming out of feet? I can have flexion by my hand going up, but I could also have flexion by my hand going down. Does that make sense? Because it has nothing to do with ups and downs. It's not a globally referenced concept. Come on.
Is that for really?
Correct. Everything, because the ankle has two different forms of getting into you. You can get in the field with your feet on the ground, you get in the field with your feet off the ground. So I didn't want any exceptions. All of your first test, because we're practicing verbiage, is all going to be things that we can either flex or extend, flexed, extended, flexion, extension.
So on side, during concessions, that what like
It gets more difficult because it's three-dimensional motion. There's more illusions, but it has to follow the same rules. When we do delve into that joint specifically, we're going to get into sequence matters, but it still follows the same rules. It's just a little bit more complicated because it's like having an Etch-a-Sketch with a third knob. It's like having an Etch-a-Sketch that can go up, down, left, right, and then the one in the middle that come up and down, but it still follows the same rules. It's a good question.
Is there any joint that people are getting confused about maybe? You understand that this and that position are different from each other? This, that. It might look like an angle, so I'm trying to think of what.
The key thing is what they're for. Flats are great for protection, longs are great to facilitate movement, shorts are great to dissipate force and summate motion, and the irregular, like me, they're the weirdos that serve very niche specific functions. Yeah. Like again, your ossicles in your ear, your incus malleus and stapes are specifically made that way to do what they do, right? You don't have them follow.
Do we need to know it's probably one test of different zone or probably what you ask like what is observation?
No. It's a good question. I still work in the function. So in other words, like I might have a picture of a skull and I'll be like, this bone aids in protection, what class I get, right? So even if I do, I'm going to still have those keywords of preferences. Good questions. No, you're good. That's okay. Okay.
Are you saying it's extended and
Yeah. So well, that's a great question. And the two joints that I gave you that happen to be in anatomical and be at the end of their road, elbows and knees, those two things are synonymous. But what's not is all the other joints, and that's where there's confusion, because some people would be like, well, if my knee from anatomical has flexion, extension, and then if I go beyond it, it's hyper. Well, that makes sense because you're not supposed to go beyond. But that doesn't mean my wrist has to follow that same flexion, extension, hyper. No, I have normal range of motion here, okay? So that's one of the things you're gonna have to learn, that because it's not just that, like my radial ulnar joint, eventually I'm gonna teach you that anatomical is being supinated because you can't go any further. So for my knee, anatomical is extended, but it's only because I can't go any further east. It's the analogy I gave about like my knee and my elbow are in Jacksonville, Florida. That's the east of the east. Like, yeah, I could go into the ocean, but the road doesn't go any further, right? So those are the two that you're just gonna have to know for this test, that anatomical is the same as I'm all the way there. And so extended is anatomical, but just for the knees and the elbows.
Position in the pictures like this.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Oh, gosh, no, that would be what we call evil. Yeah, that would be evil. Now, that being said, if I did put both of them, congratulations, you have a better chance of getting one right, because they're both right. Does that make sense? What's that? I read, you thought like, no, I'm gonna say like I'm in my lab, like with my beakers, and I'm like, I've got to get these meddling kids. I'll tell you guys, I know probably some of you have heard the rumors, you know.
I do.
That's okay.
And then trying to go be careful when she's listening to talk. I'm feeling bad about my shoe. No, over me.
You're good. You're gonna be fine. Hearing all this. I appreciate that. But think about this. If my tests were so tricky, it would be impossible to get 100. Think about it. If there was no right answer, if it was all guesswork, it'd be impossible. And every semester, it never fails. I have multiple hundreds. I have multiple A's. If I was throwing dice at these questions, statistically, it'd be impossible to get hundreds. So I think I do acknowledge that my class is different, that it's concept stuff. But if you genuinely listen to what we're trying to say, emphasize the things we emphasize. I mean, I'm literally playing poker with my cards out. You know what I'm going to ask. Nothing that I ask you is going to be any different than what I've already told you was coming. No foolies, man. Y'all gonna look at your test, it's gonna be in German? No. Barely speak English. All right, we're good? Sarah, you'll hang around a couple minutes after in case anybody has any questions, any last words? I'll let you have the last words. You kids and your technology.
That's not how it works. It works. Oh, yay, okay. Now y'all can text each other. Or y'all can text me, I guess I'll be in it, but.
And this is great for the people maybe watching the video too, right? You can, back in my day, we had scantrons.
Now we look at some examples and have notes each other.
Remember, guys, I do not mind answering questions up until Tuesday night. Okay, Tuesday night, I'm like, that's usually at 9 o'clock, I'm like, winding down. Was that? Usually earlier. But it's all about getting old. Like, I used to rip my grandma, my mama was like, Mama, why you get up at 4 o'clock? Like, that's dumb. And then there I am, like, I'm looking up at him, I'm like, Mama, I get it. Yes. Get my day started. Well, the way my brain works, like, I have to have peace and I have to be non-distracted. And so, when I come in, there's just me and the janitors. I can get some work done. Guys, I have confidence in you. I have confidence in those who put in the work. And I want you to be rewarded. I'm serious. There's no greater feeling than a student getting a grade that they are happy with because you put in the work. Like, your joy is my joy. All right. So why don't we go make some joy? Y'all have a good one.